Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in Simeon's wake. Episode 12, the Pontificating Punic and the Perplexing Pontian. Tertullians against Marcion. For a certified smart person like Tertullian, there was one name that inspired more fear and loathing among early Christians than any other. There was one name that invited, no, demanded comment from theologians and clergy and other big, important church types of people. That name was Marcion of Sinope. There is a lot to be said about Marcion, and he'll get his own supplemental episode later in the month to go over it. Long story short, Marcion was a religious teacher who offered a radical rethinking of Christianity. Marcion asserted that there were two gods, not one. One God was revealed in the Old Testament and created the world. That God was not good, but was just. In other words, that God promulgated a law and basically kept it. The other God was good, and sent Jesus Christ to save us all from the world of that creator God. When we are saved, it's not so much a redemption of our bodies as our spirits getting out of the world to live with the God of Jesus Christ in his awesome heavenly palace. As you might imagine, this view of the world also necessitated a new view of Scripture. Marcion only affirmed one gospel, which appears to be a slightly different version of the Gospel of Luke, and most of the letters of St. Paul. The Old Testament was, of course, not the book of Marcion's God. It was the book of that creator God, and therefore didn't really have much place as a theological resource, at least in terms of thinking about how Christians should live. Marcion exploded onto the theological scene, and I do mean exploded in every sense of the word. There was a group of folks who really liked his picture of the universe. But most of the church really did not like what Marcion was selling. Tertullian was among that group. He hated Marcion's theology. In fact, he hated it so much that he wrote one of his most important works against Marcion and his theology. He called his book Against Marcion because creative titles are for modern people. So let's get right into this master text with an ad break. In Simeon's Wake is brought to you by Revisions. Have you ever said something and then wished you'd said something else? Think of a great comeback 5 minutes after the argument ends? Well, so did Tertullian. Even geniuses don't always get it right the first time. That's why you have Revisions. Make your argument look smooth, seamless, and brilliant by revising your book. With Revisions, you can look way quicker on the draw than you actually are. Just hope that nobody finds your rough draft and sends that out ahead of time. But that's crazy, right? I mean, who would do that? Yeah, that's what happened to Tertullian. He had a first draft of his work against Marcion that somebody leaked, and he had to write a little preface explaining the confusion to folks who had read his earlier draft. Revisions, revealing the winding paths of your thoughts since 200 AD. Anyway, this preface out of the way, Tertullian gets down to the real business, reminding us how much Marcion's hometown sucks. This is the bit of Against Marcion that I read to you last episode, so I won't repeat it again here. Just remember, Pontus is an absolute garbage fire of a town, but the worst thing about it isn't the terrible weather, or the barbaric people, or the lack of any learning or civilization, it's that Marcion was born there. A great slam-dunk introduction to the work, immediately reminding you who the bad guy is. Marcion did not have a quick-witted reply for Tertullian's insult, mostly because he was long dead by the time Tertullian wrote that. I mean, Marcion was born in 70 AD, yeah, so he's been dead a long time. But even if he had been alive, he probably couldn't have come up with something as good, or as voluminous, because Tertullian spends the whole book throwing in new creative insults for Marcion and his followers. In fact, can we get a Tertullian insult klaxon? We're going to need some help keeping track of all this. Sick burn! Thanks, Editor Ben. With that defamatory throat-clearing out of the way, Tertullian gets right into the heart of the matter, that Marcion acknowledges two gods, the creator god, whom he mostly denigrates, and his own secret god, whom he makes to be the God of Jesus Christ. But this is absurd, Tertullian says, for everyone knows that God is like the Highlander. There can only be one. Now, you may think, that's kind of a weird thing for Tertullian to assume. Isn't the Roman Empire, like, super-duper pagan? I mean, don't they have a ton of gods? Why would Tertullian think that's obvious to everybody? Well, there are two reasons why. The first is that Tertullian's audience for this book is Christians, who do generally think there's only one God. The second is that even pagans tended to agree that there was one highest God. Sure, the Greeks had a lot of gods, but only Zeus was king of the gods. And kind of by definition, you can only have one highest God. That's what it means to be the highest, or as Tertullian calls it, the summum magnum. The summum magnum is a very fun phrase in Latin. One translator translates this phrase as the great supreme, which does sound a little bit like a failed breakout act from a Motown group. Summum magnum is much nicer. Now, at this point, Marcion might have objected if he were still alive. Marcion didn't believe that his two gods were equal. He thought the God of Jesus Christ was by far superior. To which Tertullian says, I know that, I was getting to that. Your position would have been stronger if you'd made them equal to each other, so I was refuting that first, and now I'm going to get on to your even more stupid actual argument. So then Tertullian goes on to say that you can't actually have two equal gods. To be divine is to be the greatest. So if you have one lesser god, then it's not really a god, just some kind of powerful spirit. That is very much a Christian presupposition, but since both he and Marcion claim the mantle of Christianity, it works. Having thus promulgated the pertinent truths about the great supreme, Tertullian then goes on to point out how odd Marcion's claims about the God of Jesus Christ are. First and foremost, Marcion says that the God of Jesus Christ wasn't known by anyone until Jesus appeared. Like, seriously, didn't reveal himself, had no prophets, nobody had any clue this other God existed before Jesus came on the scene. So, he is a new God in that respect. Tertullian makes fun of the Marcionites for this, claiming that they are obsessed with newness in the same way that schoolboys are excited to show off their new shoes at class. In Simeon's Wake is, once again, brought to you by Men's Fashion. If I had a nickel for every time that's happened, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's kind of weird that it's happened twice, no? Anyway, let's update that insult counter. Sick burn! In addition to this novelty being shallow, Tertullian thinks it's odd. See, Marcion claimed that the God of Jesus Christ was purely and wholly good. The God worshipped in the Old Testament was, by contrast, merely lawful. Now, Tertullian says, if Jesus' God is totally good, why did he wait so long to be known to the world? I mean, everybody knows about the Creator God. Even polytheists have an idea of this highest God who rules all others and created the world. That God has been known since the beginning. So if there is this secret God who is so good, why has he kept his goodness a complete and total secret for so long? It's not just that God became known most fully when Jesus incarnated. I mean, every Christian would say that. But Tertullian points out that Marcion's God wasn't known at all. He kept his goodness to himself, which isn't very good. Standing behind this objection is an ancient idea that the good is known by its self-diffusive character. Or, to put it in a way that doesn't sound like I just swallowed a thesaurus, it is the nature of good to give itself away. Goodness creates good for others. That's why good people share with others. They give what they can to help others. That is why God creates. It's a way of making something that God can give gifts to. So, when Marcion's God keeps knowledge of himself secret and doesn't create anything to share it with, well, that God starts looking a little stingy. which isn't very godlike at all. Not only is the Father's stinginess untoward, but the Marcionite insistence that the world is the product of a lesser God insults the world as well. Marcion, once again, taught that the Father was totally and completely different from the God who created everything. In ascribing creation to a lesser God, he made the creation itself a lesser thing. Tertullian is outraged by this. If anything, the problem with creation is that it is so majestic, people have worshipped it as divine. I mean, how can Marcion look at the sunset, or a mountain range, or even just the quiet beauty of a stream and say, nah, that's B-tier God stuff? No, it's ridiculous. Moreover, they're hypocrites. Marcionites may delight in the beauty of the world, but they don't really follow it through. As he puts it, they delight in the rain, but mock the creation of the sky. They dismiss the sea, but eat fish as part of their holy diet. Now, if you're a meat lover, you might think that this is sufficient reason alone to reject Marcion's mangled menagerie of mediocre magnificonda. But Tertullian is not done. He takes a page out of the playbook of atheists. He tells Marcion to prove the existence of this second hidden God. Now, Tertullian's point here is that most philosophers in his day established the existence of the highest God through the creation of the material world. They looked out on a world in which things were constantly coming into being and then disappearing from being, and they reasoned that the only way this world could be supported was if there was a divine being, self-existent, who could support the being of all creatures. In modern terms, this argument is still around, by the way. It's called the cosmological argument, and there are various versions of it, some more sophisticated than others, but the basic intuition is the same. Nowadays, somebody might say, well, if the universe came from the Big Bang, what created the Big Bang? Whatever that thing is, it's God. Tertullian's point is that this argument only proves the existence of a God who creates. So if you're arguing that there's a God who didn't create anything, what's your evidence that such a being exists? Now, that's a pretty sassy argument, using the atheists against a heretic. But on the Tertullian sassiness scale, we're at like a 2 out of 10. Tertullian ramps up his shade via the time-honored practice of making fun of astrology. I'll let Tertullian do the talking here, and I quote, "Well then, Marcion's God has now advanced into notice just when he willed, when he could, when the destined hour arrived. For perhaps he was hindered by his leading star, or some weird malignance, or Saturn in quadrature, or Mars at the trine. The Marcionites are very strongly addicted to astrology, nor do they blush to get their livelihood by help of the very stars which were made by the Creator whom they scorn." End quote. In other words, maybe Marcion's God is like the Marcionites themselves, whining that they're having a bad day because Mercury is in retrograde, canceling plans to align their chakras, etc., etc. Very silly all around. The Weird Malignants would be an excellent band name, though. Okay, update the insult counter. Sick bird! But even sillier than their reliance on astrology is Marcion's claim that he's saying nothing new. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the supplemental episode on Marcion, but Marcion claimed that he was merely restoring the true gospel that other disciples had perverted. This prompts Tertullian to retort with the devastating one-liner, "O Christ, most enduring Lord, who bore so many years with this interference with your revelation, until Marcion forsooth came to your rescue." Sick bird! I love this line. You can practically feel Tertullian's eyes rolling through the page. Oh yes, how patient Jesus was to sit quietly and allow his gospel to be perverted for literal decades until Marcion came along to set things right. I also really like the use of the word forsooth here. It's a lovely old English word. We don't hear it nearly often enough. Of course, Tertullian didn't pick that word. The translator did. And a lot of these old Christian texts were translated in the 1800s, which means you get lots of fun, old-timey words like forsooth or betwixt. In Simeon's Wake, now brought to you by Victorian Vocabulary. Now, while Tertullian's old-timey English translators may have enjoyed his language, they would not have enjoyed another key point that he makes: that Marcion's God fails to be good precisely because he fails to be appropriately emotional. This is a really fascinating point, because it shows one of the big divergences between Tertullian and so many other writers and thinkers in the period. It's not uncommon for philosophers, and even a lot of Christians, to agree with Marcion in thinking that part of God's perfection lies in a kind of disinterested goodness. On this reading, God isn't really perturbed by anything that happens in the world. God is just concerned with doing good in bad situations. A modern example of this would be a surgeon who is not perturbed by the horrors of a patient's disease, but is laser-focused on saving the patient's life with an operation. The point in that case is you don't actually want the surgeon to be perturbed by that, because if so, it means they're not going to do as good of a job. But Tertullian says that this kind of detachment is, in God, a moral weakness. So, for example, Tertullian thinks that anger is not just an appropriate reaction to injustice, it is a morally necessary one. A God who never gets angry is not a God who can enforce a law or apply consequences to evil actions. It is, of course, possible to lose control of one's anger and go overboard in your punishment, but cutting off all anger is not the morally appropriate solution. Justice, in other words, is a part of goodness, and justice cannot be enacted without some feelings of anger or strife or effort. That's kind of the moral fuel, if you like, that allows justice to be done. Now, keep that idea in the back of your mind for now. It'll come up a lot in this book, especially in his defense of God the Creator, which is what he turns to next. Remember, Marcion argued that the Old Testament reveals a God who created the world and is lawful but not good. He then says that such a God is by definition not the good God that Jesus reveals. Tertullian needs to prove that the two gods Marcion proclaims are actually one and the same. Now, his arguments for this are pretty straightforward. First of all, if the Creator God isn't good, then why are all of his works good? After all, Genesis 1 says it over and over again: God saw that X was good. It doesn't say God imagined X was good because, bless him, he can't think of anything better. No, it says God saw that X was good. If things are really truly good, and if a God can make good things, then that's because God is good. Period. End of story. Except it's not the end of the story, because Marcion has two arguments that he uses to prove that the Old Testament God isn't good. First, he points out that God created a world in which Adam and Eve could fall to sin, which seems super mean. Tertullian answers this in Book 2, so we'll cover it there. Second, Marcion goes to one of his favorite proof texts, Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7. In the King James Version, God says, and I quote, "I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things." End quote. So Marcion looks at this and says, aha, this is proof that God does create evil, and a being who creates evil could never be totally good. But he's on shaky ground here. Tertullian points out that the Hebrew word translated as evil can mean a whole bunch of different things, and more modern translations of the Bible recognize this. For example, the NRSV renders that verse as, I form light and create darkness, I make weal and create woe, I the Lord do all these things. In other words, God can make things that are unpleasant as well as things that are good. For example, God can make the Ark of the Covenant, which is a very good and powerful thing. However, God can also make it so that if you are an evil Nazi villain in the Indiana Jones franchise, then opening the Ark of the Covenant will result in your face getting melted off in a spectacularly tacky scene that moms won't let their children watch because they think it's too scary for them. Is getting your face melted nice? No, but if you don't want to get your face melted off, don't blame God, just try not being a Nazi. Be better, and you won't get your face melted off. Anyway, I've gotten a little off track. The point is, this logic leads to Tertullian's next major argument, where we see just how he understands God's moral character. If we had not fallen, then God would have simply given us good, pleasant things all the time. Unfortunately, we fell, and due to our fallen nature, God has to entice us to moral goodness with rewards and punishments. We are rewarded when we do well and punished when we do poorly. Of course, we like the rewards better than the punishments. That's kind of the point. It doesn't make the rewards morally superior to the punishments. They're both appropriate responses to different human scenarios. Now, all of that seems reasonable enough. But then Tertullian gets into his line-by-line reading of the Bible, and the strains in his arguments start to show. For example, Marcion points out that God calls himself jealous in Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, and warns that he will hold children responsible for their parents' sins. That is kind of the opposite of goodness. It's also, for what it's worth, the opposite of justice. The kids do anything wrong, they shouldn't be punished for that. So I think Marcion is in trouble if he wants to say that the God of the Old Testament is even just. But I'm editorializing. Tertullian's counter is that God needed such strong penalties to keep our sinful impulses in check. Parents who may not care about their own welfare may be kept in line if God threatens their children's welfare. Now, leaving aside for a moment the fact that this is the same morality a hostage-taker uses, it's worth noting that this shows just how brutal Tertullian thinks human nature is. For him, people don't just happen to sin. They are so inclined to sin that only incredibly harsh punishments can induce them to be good. Small wonder, then, that Tertullian wanted a more restrictive church with harsher punishments for stepping out of line. He thought that was all people would respond to. As a side note, I have a personal gripe to register here. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5 is one of the most misinterpreted passages in the whole Bible. Everybody reads this verse and freaks out about God visiting the sins of parents and grandparents on children and grandchildren. In fact, they freak out so much that they don't bother to read the next verse. Taken together, here is what these two verses read, and I quote, "I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me," and here's verse 6, "but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments." End quote. The whole passage is about how God's mercy is 330 times more powerful than God's justice. I mean, if you have in 1,000 generations of your family 3 or 4 people who have shown love towards God, even if the last 4 generations in your family have been bad, you're gonna come out even in the wash. Ugh. Anyway, this all makes it a really unhelpful passage for both Marcion and Tertullian. But don't let reading the texts get in the way of a good justification for your theology, I guess. Anyway, that's book 1 of Against Marcion. You can think of it as sort of the end of part 1. Book 2 deals more with Marcion's account of 2 gods. Tertullian here spills a lot of ink to prove that the God who created the world is in fact good, and the God that Marcion says is good doesn't exist at all. Now, this is kind of an interesting strategy, rhetorically speaking. There was another option open to Tertullian. Instead of trying to prove that the creator God is good, he could try to prove that Marcion's good God is in fact identical to the creator. The result would be the same, but the starting point would be different. And on its face, it might seem easier to start with the God that everybody agrees is goodness and sunshine and rainbows. But Tertullian doesn't do this, and his reason has to do with what he thinks it means to be God. As we discussed earlier, Tertullian thinks that the way we know about the existence of God is through observing the created world. And as far as he is concerned, that's the only way that God is known to us apart from the revelation of Scripture. So he wants to start with the God we know, the Creator God, and then argue that this God is in fact also good. Well, he half wants to argue, and half wants to toss off stone-cold one-liners and puns against Marcion. But when you're a literary genius like Tertullian, you can have your cake and eat it too. To wit, and I quote here, "The goodness of God having, therefore, provided man for the pursuit of knowledge of himself, added this to its original notification, that it first prepared a habitation for him, the vast fabric of the world to begin with, and then afterwards the vaster one of a higher world, that he might on a great as well as on a smaller stage practice and advance in his probation, and so be promoted from the good which God had given him, that is, from his high position, to God's best, that is, to some higher abode. In this good work, God employs a most excellent minister, even his own word. My heart, he said, has emitted my most excellent word. Let Marcion take hence his first lesson on the noble fruit of this most truly excellent tree. But, like a most clumsy clown, he has grafted a good branch on bad stock. The sapling, however, of his blasphemy shall never be strong. It shall wither with its planter, and thus shall be manifested the nature of the good tree. Look at the total result. How fruitful was the word! God issued his fiat, and it was done. God also saw that it was good. Not as if he were ignorant of the good until he saw it, but because it was good, he therefore saw it, and honored it, and set his seal upon it. Okay, we are updating the Tertullian insult klaxon for arboreal takedowns now. Sick burn! Now, Tertullian has done three important things here. First, he points out that in Genesis it says that God created a world of things that are good. Like we said before, if the creator God isn't good, how could he make good things? And why would he plan to give humanity even better things? The idea that this God isn't good is just silly. Second, Tertullian begins to bring in his notion of the Trinity by speaking of the Word, aka the Son, aka the second person of the Trinity. The point is that God would not create a world through the holy good Word if that God was also not good. Also recall that the Word becomes flesh in Jesus Christ, per John chapter 1, and if Marcion thinks that the Creator God has nothing to do with Jesus Christ, then the fact that the world is made through Jesus is kind of a problem for him. Third, Tertullian finds a fun set of metaphors to use to say that Marcion's heresy is stupid and dumb, and that it will probably die out because of its stupidity and dumbness. However, the Marcionites are not without their own snappy comebacks. After all, if the Creator God is so good, then how come he allowed humanity to fall to the devil? Why didn't he save us from temptation? Where's God's goodness now, Mr. Sassy Tertullian, huh? In response to this, Tertullian deploys a version of a justly famous argument that endures down to the present day. It is called the free will defense. It basically goes like this. One of the gifts that God gave the human being was to have a free will. In other words, to be capable of doing either right or wrong. Now, by doing so, God opened the door to the possibility of people doing wrong. But, the argument goes, a free will is such an important good thing that it's worth the risk. Different folks will give you different reasons as to why free will is so important. Tertullian thinks it has to do with the nature of the human being. God created the human being to be in the divine image. Now God is free. How could God's image not be free? Humans were destined to rule over the earth. How could they rule over the earth but be slaves to their own will? In other words, if you're going to make something like a human being, free will is an essential part of the picture. Making a human being without free will is like making a tomato soup without tomato. It's just not the same thing anymore. Now, the Marcionites would apparently argue that God was still not off the hook, because if humans have a spirit, and that spirit sins, then that implicates God, because apparently they thought the human spirit was kind of like a tiny piece of God's essence. That is not a terribly interesting argument to me, because we don't typically think that way anymore, but it does give Tertullian a chance to show off his knowledge of Greek. You might think that Tertullian would just say that the human spirit is not a piece of God, but no. Instead, he says that the human spirit is not exactly a spirit. His version of the Greek Old Testament doesn't use the typical Greek word for spirit, which is pneuma, when it describes the human spirit. Instead, it uses a different word, which he translates as afflatus, which is a Latin word that means something like breath. Afflatus proceeds from spirit, but it's not spirit. It has a lightness that spirit does not, a more slender nature. It's kind of like the Diet Coke version of spirit. In Simeon's Wake is now brought to you by Diet Spirit. All of the salvation, none of the implied divine responsibility for your mess-ups. Diet Heresy. Enjoy refuting heresy against the eternal truths of your God, guilt-free. Tertullian then explains more about his theory of how goodness and justice work together. As we discussed earlier, Tertullian basically thinks that God's justice is essentially God's response to evil. At the beginning, at creation, God is good to all things. But when things turn toward evil, God has to use justice in order to protect what is good. He even goes so far as to say that goodness needs justice to protect it and advocate for it in the face of evil. In other words, goodness is kind of just sunshine and rainbows and mercy and softness. Anything aggressive isn't part of goodness. But sometimes it's good to be aggressive in the face of evil. That's where justice comes in. Justice also seems to have a kind of administrative function in the cosmos, keeping things in their proper place even when evil isn't around. So Tertullian will describe God's justice as separating night from day, separating the waters above the heavens from the waters below, etc., etc., which does suggest that justice is not solely a result of sin, it's more a result of difference. After this fascinating treatment, Tertullian then gives us a poetic endorsement of the importance of justice, and I quote, "What sort of being ought you to wish God to be? Would it be right to prefer that he should be such that sins might flourish under him, and the devil mock him? Would you suppose him to be a good God, who should be able to make a man worse by security in sin? Who is the author of good but he who also requires it? In like manner, who is a stranger to evil, except him who is its enemy? Who is its enemy besides him who is its conqueror? Who else is its conqueror than he who is its punisher? Thus God is wholly good, because in all things he is on the side of good." End quote. Now, this does not mean that God enjoys punishment for punishment's sake. Tertullian says that the point of God's justice is remedial. The idea is that folks will learn from their punishments and go back to doing good. Tertullian also points out that even if the Bible speaks of God as having human emotions, this is a kind of metaphor to help us understand God. God may have emotions that aren't exactly like ours. Even if the Bible says that God is angry or grieving or jealous, etc., that doesn't mean God's feelings are exactly like our feelings. After all, the Bible also talks about God's hands and eyes and stuff. Do we think that God has a body exactly like a human body? Well, no. Otherwise, God wouldn't have needed to take on a body in the incarnation. Ditto with the emotions. We humans have small, finite emotions that are corrupted by sin. God's emotions are big, divine, and perfect. So even if we call one of God's emotions jealousy, it is a perfected good version of what can seem to us like a rather ugly trait. Indeed, even all of the many, many laws that God enjoined upon the Israelites were for their good. Why? Well, because by creating legislation to cover every area of human life, God gave people an opportunity to think about God no matter what they were doing. It's not that there was something especially godly about, say, not wearing mixed fabrics or not eating pork. It's that God gave the Israelites a way of being in the world that would constantly remind them of their relationship with God. Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo makes a rather similar point when he says that Jewish law is rebellion against apathy. It's rebellion against a way of living that dismisses things as not mattering. For Jewish law, it does matter how your clothes are made, how your food was prepared, when and how your prayers are said. It's a way of seeing the world as charged with the sacred and meaningful. But most important of all, it provides Tertullian with yet another occasion for a spicy insult, and I quote, "But these saucy cuttles of heretics, under the figure of whom the law about things to be eaten prohibited this very kind of pescatory aliment, as soon as they find themselves confuted, eject the black venom of their blasphemy, and so spread about in all directions the object which, as now plain, they severally have in view, when they put forth such assertions and protestations as shall obscure and tarnish the rekindled light of the Creator's bounty." End quote. The law prohibited the eating of cuttlefish, and heretics are even worse than cuttlefish. They are spiritual cuttlefish. Time to update the Tertullian insult counter. Sick burn. The rest of Book 2 consists of Tertullian defending particular behaviors of God in the Old Testament from Marcion's charges of arbitrariness or cruelty. We won't go through all of them because, once again, we have to summarize if we're going to make it through this whole book, but here are a few. Marcion complained that God let the Israelites take the Egyptians' stuff when they left Egypt, which sounds like God is endorsing stealing. Tertullian points out in response that the Israelites had, been enslaved for 400 years, and were essentially collecting a little bit of back pay for the work they and their ancestors had done. You heard it here first, folks. Tertullian endorses reparations. Furthermore, Marcion complained that God first chose Saul to be king, knowing he would mess up, then rejected him when he messed up. To which Tertullian says, what do you want from God? Is he supposed to reject Saul before Saul's done anything bad? That's not right. Is he supposed to only choose people who will never go wrong? Well, then we're all in trouble. And if you really want proof that the Creator God is merciful and gentle, then look no further than the fact that he became incarnate, suffered, died, and rose again for us. Which brings us right to the subject matter of Book 3, the ministry of Jesus Christ. Although in Tertullian's eyes his work is done. Since he's shown there is only one God, the Creator, there is no way that Jesus can be the emissary of a different God. But truth should employ all its resources, Tertullian says, even if you didn't buy my arguments in Book 2, or missed that part because of yet another publication error, you can be persuaded by what I write here. Plus, Tertullian's insult counter is not high enough yet, so he really needs to boost his numbers. Now recall that for Marcion, Jesus Christ is the first time in world history that the truly good God has made himself known. The Creator God didn't know anything about Jesus or expect him. So Tertullian starts off by saying this is inappropriate for a couple of reasons. The first is that this would mean the good God hadn't planned things out. If God providentially orders the universe, you'd think he would set up things ahead of time. If Jesus just appears, literally deus ex machina, then that isn't true. Second, Tertullian makes a fascinating little argument that since the Father was first, it was fitting that he announced the Son's coming. This is partly to give the Son his authority, just like if you're a king, you want to tell a vassal if you're sending them a messenger before the messenger arrives. I mean, you can't have every Joe Schmo saying they're your messenger. No, only the ones you announce beforehand will have authority to speak in your name. The other part of the argument is that Tertullian seems to think this is how the Trinity works. The Father is first in being. The Father begets the Son. The Father is known before the Son, so the Father should announce the Son before the Son appears. There is an order of operations in the Trinity, and it always goes Father to Son to Spirit. There's a whole lot of Trinitarian theology to unpack there, but that'll have to wait for another time. Tertullian then considers a counter-argument. Christ does miracles when he comes. Isn't that enough to prove his authority? Does he need Old Testament prophecies? No and yes, Tertullian says. Miracles aren't enough to prove his authority because Jesus will tell us later that teachers are going to come along and do miracles and try to trick you into following them instead of him. Miracles prove that you are in league with the supernatural, but there are evil spirits in the world just like there are good ones. Unless you think that Jesus gets alliance just because he happens to be first, just like those guys who get to the public baths first and take a super long time in there and think they have a right to the baths and don't think about those of us later in line at all. This is not a bit I am doing, by the way, I swear. Tertullian actually talks about the people who get to the baths first and hog all the space. I'm guessing he wrote this passage after a particularly bad day at the bathhouse. The ultimate literary multitasker. Complain about heretics and your neighbors in one go. Now, of course, that's not exactly an insult. Can we get an old man yells at cloud klaxon?
Don't mess with me!
Yeah, I suppose that'll work. Now, if Jesus was announced ahead of time in good and decent order, then Tertullian just has to point out the harmony between Old Testament prophecy and Christ's actions in the New Testament. To do this, he has to make two quick points that he expects Marcionites will agree with. The first is that occasionally prophecies speak in the past tense, even when the events are in the future. His example here is Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. Now, even though this is past tense, Tertullian takes it as given that this is a prophecy about Jesus, because, well, that's basically how every ancient Christian of his day interpreted it. The basic idea is that because God's perspective is eternal, God speaks about the crucifixion as something already accomplished, even if it's still in the future according to human perspective. So that's his first point. His second point is that prophecies speak using metaphors and allegories, which is, pretty basic. Just because God calls Canaan a land flowing with milk and honey does not mean you will find any literal rivers of milk and honey flowing through its borders. Now, Tertullian suggests that Marcion makes common cause with the Jews, inasmuch as both deny that Jesus Christ is the one predicted by the Old Testament scriptures. He seems to be arguing by association here. We Christians disagree with Jews on this point, so we must also disagree with Marcion. He doesn't go into too many specific prophecies, but he does note that there appear to be two sets of prophecies about the Messiah. One set predicts him coming in a humble state as one of the poor and oppressed, and the other predicts him coming with exalted glory to rule the world. This is, in fact, a standard feature of Jewish Christian arguments even today. Jesus did not, in fact, go on to rule the world in a visible, tangible way after his resurrection, which for Jews inveighs against his messiahship. But Tertullian says the two prophecies simply refer to the two advents of Christ. First, he came in humility, circa 0 AD. Next, he will come in power and great glory. Tertullian says that once again we must distinguish between the two natures of these prophecies, the nature of Christ's humility and the nature of his glory. Marcion, however, has only one nature, the nature of being a big, dumb, stupid heretic. And since it's been a while, Tertullian gives us another insult, and I quote, "Our heretic must now vomit forth the virulence of his own disposition, as when he alleges Christ to be a phantom. Except indeed that this opinion of his will be sure to have others to maintain it in his precocious and somewhat abortive Marcionites, whom the Apostle John designated as antichrists when they denied that Christ has come in the flesh. Not that they did this with the view of establishing the right of the other God, for on this point they had also been branded by the same apostle, but because they started with assuming the incredibility of an incarnate God." End quote. Sick burn! Insults aside, this is a point on which most scholars think that Tertullian got Marcion wrong. Our best evidence is that Marcion thought Jesus was not a ghost. Jesus actually had a body. However, Jesus' body was not made of ordinary matter like ours. It was made of, special matter, spiritual matter on something. That's different than other groups of heretics which said that Jesus only appeared to live and breathe and eat and sleep and die like an illusion. Marcion's Christ is not an illusion, but his body is different from ours. Now, I'm going to defend Tertullian a bit on this front because, well, this is his episode after all. Tertullian might have thought that Marcion's Christ was a ghost because Tertullian didn't think that ghosts were just illusions. If you think of ghosts as mere illusions, then Marcion's Christ is clearly no ghosts. But if you think of ghosts as being physical entities composed of different substances than humans, well, starts looking like a ghost. Now, who thinks of ghosts that way? Well, most famously, the 1984 classic blockbuster film Ghostbusters, which states that ghosts are made of a substance called ectoplasm. If they weren't made of matter, then you couldn't suck them up in the vacuum thingies that the Ghostbusters had on their back. Duh. But this idea wasn't just around in 1980s films starring Bill Murray. Remember, last main episode, we talked about how Tertullian believed that everything in the universe was made of matter, including God. Tertullian just thought that spirits were composed of a different kind of matter than things like human bodies. So, when Marcion starts saying that Jesus had a body, but it was made of a different kind of matter than our bodies, I suspect Tertullian thought that that sounded like a ghost to him. And he goes on to point out that a ghost Christ would be of no help to us. Human beings need human interaction to be helped. That's why God took on human flesh to help us. What good would it be for a weird ectoplasm Christ to be crucified? Or heal us with a touch, for that matter. Yeah, you could see again, but there'd be that weird green stuff all over your eyes, and you'd be weirded out, and the whole thing would just leave a bad taste in your mouth. I mean, Tertullian didn't put it that way, but I'm pretty sure that's what he meant. Now, Tertullian takes a break from complaining about Christ's body to get into specific prophecies. One such prophecy is in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 4. For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, my father and my mother, he shall take away the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria before the king of Assyria. Now, Marcion takes this to mean that the prophesied Messiah of the Old Testament is a warlike fellow. The Messiah is going to come and beat up the kings of rival nations. Tertullian refutes him, partially to defend the honor of his Lord and Savior, partially because he can't pass up an opportunity to make fun of Marcion's homeland. And I quote, "You should first examine the point of age, whether it can be taken to represent Christ as even yet a man, much less a warrior. Although, to be sure, he might be about to call to arms by his cry as an infant, might be about to sound the alarm of war not with a trumpet, but with a little rattle, might be about to seek his foe not on a horseback or in chariot or from parapet, but from nurse's neck or nursemaid's back, and so be destined to subjugate Damascus and Samaria from his mother's breast. It is a different matter, of course, when the babes of your barbarian Pontus spring forth to the fight. They are, I think, taught to lance before they lacerate, swathed at first in sunshine and ointment, afterwards armed with the satchel and rationed on bread and butter. Now, since nature certainly nowhere grants to man to learn warfare before life, to pillage the wealth of Damascus before he knows his father and mother's name, it follows that the passage in question must be deemed to be a figurative one. Sick burn. Although, I gotta be honest, guys, this one felt a little lazy to me. Tertullian has already dissed Pontus. This feels more like a stand-up comedian reusing material than anything else. But maybe he had recycling on the brain, because Tertullian reuses passages in the Bible in order to refute Marcion. He points out that the Bible often uses military metaphors to describe virtue. Being good is a war against one's evil impulses, and the Word of God is compared to a sword in Revelation. So too with the prophecies. Jesus conquers, but he conquers through gentleness and humility, not warfare. Tertullian then goes on to give a whole bunch of proof texts from the Old Testament that correspond to Christ's life, arguing that only Jesus could be the subject of every single prophecy mentioned therein. I'm not going to go through all of them because that is way too long for this episode. If you want a flavor of what he's saying, just read the Gospel of Matthew, which helpfully tells you anytime Jesus does something that fulfills an Old Testament prophecy. But all this does raise the question of what exactly Tertullian would make of the Bible. Because as you may recall from the very beginning of this episode, Marcion's Bible looked quite different from what we know today, and certainly from what Tertullian knew. Marcion's New Testament consisted of most of Paul's letters and a version of the Gospel of Luke that had some key differences from Tertullian's copy. More on those differences in the supplemental on Marcion. For now, just know that this is a problem. Because, after all, Tertullian can cite examples from Matthew, Mark, John, and his version of Luke all he wants. But if the Marcionites can just say that those scriptures don't count and they aren't the real gospel, well, what are you going to do? So Tertullian has to make an argument about whose gospel is legitimate. Unsurprisingly, he thinks it's his version. Shocker, I know. But his arguments are interesting for all kinds of important reasons, because they set the stage for how the church thinks about dissident groups like the Marcionites. So let's dive in. Tertullian's big point is fairly simple. When you have two rival versions of the same text, look for which one is older. After all, there has to be an original version, and the other version has been changed. But you can't change a text that doesn't exist yet, so find the older text and boom, there you have your authentic version. Now, Tertullian's version of Luke has been known across the church. Churches from Spain to Syria all know Luke's gospel. Marcion's version wasn't known before him, and it's only used by his churches. So that clearly makes Luke, as Tertullian knows it, the better version. Tertullian also has a secondary argument, a bit less powerful, to the effect that division always comes after unity. The idea appears to be that you need to have a unity before you can divide it. Hence, Marcion introduces division into the Bible after the apostles, who are all in harmony with each other. Now, that is a bit less of a common sense argument than his previous one, because people are messy, and sometimes they are divided from the beginning. but for Tertullian's purposes, the argument makes sense. Now, scholars today are a bit less sold on Tertullian's thesis. We'll cover this a bit more in the supplementals, but things are a bit more complicated in textual history than Tertullian posits. A lot of the Gospels didn't start with one original version that got modified over time. A lot of them circulated in bits and pieces that were only later compiled into one big book. In other words, it's not that one person would write one book and then one heretic would sit down and cross out all the parts he didn't like. However, it's a lot funnier to imagine it Tertullian's way, so let's go with that for now. Tertullian then gives us a very funny imagined scene. How fortunate Jesus Christ is that Marcion came along. Here he was, sitting up in heaven, sighing and fretting that the apostles kept screwing up the message until Marcion came along some 5 decades later after the crucifixion to get things back on track. How lucky for the eternal God that Marcion was so helpful. Sick bird! Insult counting aside, I do actually want to note that even though he's being snarky here, I think this is probably Tertullian's best argument. The idea that a good God would hide himself for thousands of years of human history, then immediately become incarnate in Jesus Christ, then pretty much immediately allow his gospel to be perverted by heretically minded apostles, doesn't look like much of a God. Tertullian's making an argument here based on divine providence, that God is going to keep the truth alive in the church some way, somehow. So, all that to say, don't let the insults distract you from the fact that Tertullian's doing real theological work here. Having thus established, at least to his own satisfaction, that Marcion's version of Luke is silly and wrong, he's not done. Tertullian wants to prove that even on its own terms, Marcion's doctrine is not supported by his own gospel. Take, for example, Luke chapter 4, which is where Marcion's version of the gospel starts. You attentive listeners will note that this means that Marcion's gospel has no birth narrative. That's right. There's no account of Jesus' nativity in Marcion's gospel. He was one of the very first authors of the war on Christmas. Now, Tertullian is, for some strange reason, not interested in the slogans of 21st century American political discourse. He is more interested in pointing out that when grinchy old Marcion finally decides to pick up the story in Luke 4, Jesus is returning to Galilee. Now that's interesting because that is exactly what he is prophesied to do in the Old Testament. But there will be no gloom for those who were in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time he will make glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. On those who lived in a land of deep darkness, on them light has shined. That's Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, for those of you keeping score at home. Now remember Tertullian's aim. It's to show that the Old and New Testaments tell one cohesive story about one Creator God and one Jesus Christ. If Jesus Christ is doing the things the Old Testament said he would, well, that's good evidence that there's one unified story being told. But Tertullian is not done. He is going to go through the entire Gospel of Luke, line by line, pointing out all the ways that Luke's narrative supports his thesis and not Marcion's. No, Tertullian is not done by a long shot. But guess what? We are done, because that would be way too long for an already long episode. So let's move on to the last book, Book 5. But even that is easy sailing for us, because Book 5 is just Tertullian doing the same anti-Marcionite readings of Paul's epistles, like he just did with Luke's Gospels in Book 4. Once again, he goes line by line refuting Marcion's readings of the Scriptures. Here's just one example of how he argues. Perhaps you will remember Paul in 1 Corinthians talking about the foolishness of God and how it's wiser than the wisdom of the world. What you may not remember, as evidence of that claim, Paul cites Isaiah, specifically Isaiah chapter 29, verse 14, when God promises to destroy the wisdom of the wise. So once again, if the God of the Old Testament has nothing to do with Jesus Christ, how come Paul is citing the Old Testament? There are a lot more arguments for Tertullian to make, but we're going to skip all that for now. what we can see from Tertullian is that there's a very particular idea that is emerging about what constitutes heresy. Tertullian presents Marcion as a later innovator in contrast to the faithful apostles who passed on the teachings of Christ without change or adulteration. In contrast, Marcion reviewed the teachings of Christ and, not being sufficiently impressed with them, decided to make a few changes. In the course of making these innovations, Marcion managed to mess up the whole point of the gospel by separating Jesus Christ from his Father, the Creator God of the Old Testament. Without that link, we can't say that creation is good, and we can't say that God redeems the world. All we can do is hope for kind of a rescue from the world by a God who showed up out of nowhere and who allows his message to be co-opted, corrupted, distorted, and even destroyed with alarming ease. Tertullian's Marcion playbook will be run many times over the centuries against many dissident groups. They will be portrayed as heretical innovators who couldn't be patient and stick with the church's teachings. Now, some teachers deserved that accusation. Many did not. Many of them were trying to present the church's teachings faithfully as they understood them. But whether his assessments of their character were on the money, Tertullian also bequeathed a way of thinking about when a teacher had strayed beyond the bounds of permissible doctrine. Did their theology alter the story of salvation? Did their doctrines clarify God's work in the world, or did they make it harder to understand God? And did they fit with the story told by Christianity's earliest texts? We will have many opportunities to revisit these questions, for they are not just the questions of Tertullian and Marcion. Tertullian may have opened the door to them, but they would remain a part of Christianity's history forever. The questions of who is in and who is out, of what can be believed and what cannot, of what constitutes the boundaries of the church. All of these and more will recur again and again as generations of the faithful attempt to trace the faintest edges of Simeon's wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.